Hey there, I'm Matt. I run product design and engineering at Owner, and I'm joined by Sute. Let me try that again. That didn't go very well. Hey there, I'm Matt. I run product design and engineering here at Owner, and I'm joined by my good friend Suhail, who has worked at Monzo for many, many years now. If you haven't heard of Monzo, I don't know where you've been living, probably under a rock, but Monzo is one of the UK's like defining banks. As of 2025, it reported it had 12 million customers, and Monzo's and Suhail's been there since, is it 8, 9 years now?
Yeah, 8 years now. 8 years now, long amount of time.
Yeah, and you currently are a principal engineer, I believe, who sits in the platform group. Can you tell us a little bit more about your role in the platform group?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, hi, my name is Suhail. I am one of the principal engineers at Monzo, and I've been at Monzo for about 8 years now. And I help lead the platform group as an individual contributor. And the platform group is responsible for building Monzo's foundational base. So we look after all of the infrastructure, the standard things that you would expect with AWS and Google Cloud, and all the sort of like cloud native relationships and things like that, and all the cloud native tools that sit on top of these providers. So, for example, your Kubernetes and your Kafka and your Cassandras and all your myriad of technologies that a modern engineering organization would adopt. But our real secret sauce is within the platform group. We also own the relationship with engineers, the developer experience that engineers interface with on a day-to-day basis. So our goal is to provide a very opinionated architecture and very opinionated code base and libraries and tools that engineers want to adopt. We now sort of force them to adopt it because that is the way to get stuff without friction onto the platform. And it comes with a bunch of batteries included, but there's only so much forcing you can do. The tools have to be really, really good for engineers to want to use them and use the standardized stack. And what we do is we help build and maintain and provide really, really good tooling and observability around that stack so that engineers can focus on building the bank and not have to worry about infrastructure.
There's so many things you said that I want to jump off. So we'll start with how big is the platform group? It sounds like you've got a really wide mandate, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got, I can't even remember the amount of squads we have because we're adding bits and pieces all over the place. We span a very wide gamut between, core platform and infrastructure, so stuff that, will interface with the app on a day-to-day basis, to things like, our data infrastructure as well, like in our data warehousing estate, making sure that we have really good modeling tooling for data modeling and analytics and business intelligence. We've also very recently done a significant amount of investment in machine learning, and this is traditional machine learning. Your neural nets and your models and the standard stuff, which is absolutely big in our domain and space, and a lot of really, really good techniques that we can adopt and run with. So we've done a significant amount of investment in machine learning. A lot of that has extended into a lot of the really cool stuff with AI and LLMs as well. And on the other side, we have teams that deal with developer experience, and also, even things that are very, very important, things like FinOps, making sure that we're not spending egregiously. Our customer unit cost is staying within control. So yeah, a really, really wide gamut of teams are included within the platform group.
And for the platform group specifically, do you find that your hiring plans are trending up since you've seen AI adoption come in, or is it kind of going flat? You're hiring less. Like, how do you think about hiring in a world where AI tooling can help you be way more productive?
Yeah, that is a great question. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff out there in the industry, which is like, all these tools are going to replace engineers. And these tools are just really, really good. Like, even the last couple of months, with all the tools out there, all of the foundational models and even the open models as well, the tools have been changed the way that we work on a day-to-day basis. Even me, like, early on, I was a bit skeptical about, like, the amount of revolution this would have on the day-to-day. But now, like, I don't even open my editor as like my first port of call when I start the day. The first thing I do is open my terminal, open Claude Code. So like, it's like fundamentally rewired how I think about my brain. And this is a journey that many engineers have gone on. For us specifically at Monzo, we've just become more ambitious. So like, ultimately our hiring plans are remaining business as usual, but we've just become more ambitious in what we want to be able to achieve. We are definitely hiring more. We've got a bunch of open roles open and continue to have them open, just because our ambition has gotten bigger and bolder, and we want to be able to do more as a result of that. Fundamentally, these tools are not going to replace all of the product things we want to be able to build. If these tools could click a finger and we could have all of our product stuff built, we would have more ambition in the product that we want to build. In general, I don't think this would be a replacement for the ambition that we have and for the people that we have and will continue to hire.
I love that answer. It's exactly what we've seen too. Is we actually want to do more of it, not less of it, right? Is great engineers can now do great things even faster. So who doesn't want more of that? I'm yet to see an empty backlog. I don't know if you've seen one yet, but I haven't seen one.
No, absolutely not. The backlogs continue to get ever bigger, and just specifically in the world of platform, the amount of people that we reach has gotten infinitely larger. Our remit, was basically to make engineers more productive, and now our remit has expanded to make the whole organization more productive. When the cost of writing code is basically zero, right? Especially for prototyping and one-offs and things like that. You still want to have a reliable and secure platform to go ship these things on. To serve them, to host them internally to users, and to have the right controls and security and mechanism. And these things need to come batteries included by default, to have observability. If you're running a model and you want to back test on some data and you want to see how that data performed, even if you've come up with an idea and sort of vibe coded a prototype before, for anything, you still need to have all of these mechanisms available. So our ambition and the amount of people that we are serving has gotten bigger.
That makes tons of sense to me. It's exactly what we've seen too. How do you think about rolling AI tools out to engineers and business users? Is there different rules or different ways they have to operate? And what does it take for a business user to land a PR in production, for example?
Yeah. I don't think we've been perfect at this. So I wouldn't take our answer as the pinnacle of perfection. I think most organizations, we're still figuring it out, right? We've had to be very, very deliberate about rolling these things out. There's one side, which is we want to give access to all of these tools. We've onboarded all of these tools, we've gone through all of the processes and gotten access to all of these tools and rolled them out to engineers as quickly as possible, so that we can get it in the hands of people and learn ourselves what these tools are capable of doing, right? And for the entire industry, this is a learning experience, right? Now, what we've been able to rely on as we've rolled these tools out to engineers is that engineers have, for example, done their secure development training, have got all of the various bits in mind, are writing code that is aligned with our stack, they're able to ask the right questions and sort of interject when the model is going off the rails, right? An engineer is able to do that because they have done that for all the time they've been engineering. When you're doing PR reviews, or when you're mentoring an engineer, or when you're questioning something you read on the internet, or you're responding to a Slack message and conversing with other humans. This is a muscle memory that they have built over time. But now you've got this different class of applications that is completely being built by non-engineers, and that is something that we've had to put we've had to really think about how we serve these tools to these people, because effectively we are now making the cost of writing code to zero. But how do we make sure that folks are aware that they shouldn't be hosting these tools on the public internet without authentication and authorization? They shouldn't be signing up to a random third-party service to go and host these tools, or they shouldn't be writing stuff that has injection capabilities, or writing stuff in a non-idiomatic language. If you write something in Prolog and you get Claude to generate it, that's all fine and dandy, but then hosting it becomes an absolute pain in the rear, and it becomes unmaintainable for anyone who doesn't really know Prolog. So there's all of these different nuances that you gotta really think about. As we release these tools to the rest of the organization, we really want to empower them, but they don't have the baseline engineering mindset. And what we don't want is, we don't want them to say, okay, right, what we will do is we will deal with this problem when you create a PR, right? Like, the PR will be the blocking, the pull request will become the blocking mechanism. Because ultimately, then we're just going to have our engineers spending all of their time that we have helped to unblock reviewing code that has been generated using AI, and there's not intended to be reviewed. Instead, how can we make sure that the boundary of harm that can be done is reduced as much as possible, based on what has been generated. And some of the risks are multifold. For example, you can host these things on for example, a container or a VM or what have you, right? But if it's a HTML page, then you also got to think about the client sandbox as well, right? You're hosting this page to a human, if that is calling out to a random third party, and exfiltrating data that way, then effectively you've just moved the attack vector from the server exfiltrating data, which you might have sandboxed away, to the client exfiltrating data. Ultimately, your data is still gone. So how do you make sure that you build the right protection mechanisms? And the protection mechanisms are out there, with all the tools that we have available on a day-to-day basis. How do you make sure that you embed those as a de facto in these tools being built? And that is the key thing that we are thinking about before unlocking all of these tools. So right now we have opened up access to all of these tools across the organization, but with caveats and limitations on the kinds of stuff that they can build and the kinds of stuff that they can host.
It makes tons of sense. Like I feel the same way, and we've heard it often quoted as the cost of generating code is going to zero, but the cost of ownership has never actually been higher. Like you've got to make sure that you have complete understanding and visibility across all of these different applications, types, use cases. And previously, you kind of had this natural bottleneck in engineering, right? And that bottleneck is disappearing, and that people can kind of go forth and deploy things in ways maybe we didn't even think about. And the risk obviously steps up. And there's now people who have access to AI tools. There's been famously lots of discussion around Mythos, kind of scanning, looking for issues and stuff. So it's more important both sides have, a really good security appetite. Like you need to make sure that internally you've got a great security story, and also those folks externally, like they don't have access to tools, I guess, that the rest of the market doesn't. So it's a really interesting time for that specific problem, right? So one thing I want to come back to, Suhail, is we talked a little bit about you having a really opinionated stack, which I love, and it's also actually something I've always really admired about Monzo. Is there's always kind of a clear golden path, if you will, of how to do things. Would love to hear a little bit more about that, like how you think about having that opinionated setup, how you evolve it, and then potentially how AI has been helpful or hindered you in kind of carrying on that journey that you've had since very early in Monzo's engineering days.
Yeah, that is an excellent question and quite a loaded one. So I'll try and cover all of the aspects, as swiftly as I can. So yes, we have a very opinionated stack. We have a monorepo, especially for our backend, but this also applies to other technologies as well. We have a bunch of monorepos around this area, and effectively our goal is to have a centralized way of doing things. So we've invested over the last decade in having, for example, service generators and code generators and analysis checks, and just effectively having one structure fits all, which is absolutely fantastic for AI and LLMs to hoover in, because we can say, here are 3,000. We have over 3,000 microservices in production in our backend monorepo. Here are 3,000 examples of how we write code here at Monzo. Don't go and invent a new way and import a bunch of third-party dependencies, because it is very likely that this has been solved in another part of the code base, and you are able to either copy the implementation or abstract the implementation away, or use an existing vendor library or what have you, which is absolutely fantastic, because it means that we get a lot of reusability within our platform, while still maintaining our existing structure and guardrails, and we're still able to have all of the guardrails, with static analysis checks and authorization checks and authentication checks, still apply, right? If we're using, for example, a bunch of different HTTP serving libraries in Go, which is the predominant language that we use in our monorepo, right? Then we need to write static analysis checks to make sure you're doing the right authorization and authentication mechanisms for all of those different systems. Whereas we have a very opinionated HTTP library, is the one that is used across all services. We're able to write these checks once and have everyone benefit. And leading on to that, this kind of stuff really, really helps when it comes to migrations. I think that has been a huge unlock. For example, let's say that you want to deprecate a method, or you want to move folks towards a new implementation. Maybe the old way of doing things was not the recommended way, bad patterns, or something that is particularly missing. There would have been a lot of hand rolling you would have had to have done to either write a Go migrator, a service migrator, or what have you, that would parse the AST and regenerate new code, or something like that. And AI has just reduced that barrier to entry to zero, right? You're able to write really complex analysis, really complex checks, really complex code rewriting, the code mod style tools, Go native, and just even standard code mod tools, at the click of a finger, which is absolutely revolutionary. This is how I've been using Claude on a day-to-day basis. You have an incident, code-related incident, and you want to go add a check for it. The cost of writing the check has now become zero. You write the check once. You're not spending significant amounts of time in AST code. You're able to give it a bunch of test cases of success and failure, and then the whole engineering community is able to benefit, which I think is really, really powerful. So I think these things have really, really helped, is that AI and LLMs are able to reference this really well curated code base that we have invested significantly in. Now, the downside of that is that, again, that opinionated nature. So I take, for example, our web monorepo. Our web monorepo follows, for example, the current version of React and a bunch of other frameworks. And especially what I found with the LLMs, or what's been my personal experience, is that it is very, very eager to go just pull in other dependencies, or go and upgrade your node packages, and just go and upgrade to a later version of React. And that same level of checking is then sort of falls over because not everything has been brought along for the ride. Especially as the web ecosystem moves extremely sporadically and very, very rapidly as well. There's a new hot framework on the block, nearly every other week now, that people want to adopt. So I think there's a benefit, especially when you have a well curated code base, and we get a lot of benefits, ecosystem benefits with choosing Go, and Go's type safety and the amount of investment that we put in. But then there are other areas where it will just go completely off the rails and get stuck, and get into a loop and just decide, okay, right, I'm going to go go pull in this third party dependency, and then just cause havoc in your well curated garden. And at that point, it's just spent a whole bunch of tokens, and the engineer then has to bail it out at some point. I think that has been one of the things that we really want to solve for, that I don't think we've got a perfect answer for before unleashing this as a background capability. So one of the things that we're investing very heavily in is sort of background agents. You're able to kick off a task, go for your commute, go for your whatever, not need to be hands at keyboard. But if you've got something churning away for 2 hours, consuming hundreds of thousands of tokens, and it just goes down a completely absurd path, where the engineer should have bailed it out 5 minutes ago. So 5 minutes in to a 2 hour long running cycle, that is a problem, right? Because that's just cost us a bunch of money and wasted a bunch of time that the engineer could have used better if we had prompted it better. I think this is an interesting dilemma, because we still want to maintain control over our code, whereas you look at a lot of the projects that people are using these for. These are entirely greenfield projects. You kick off a repo, you don't care about the code, it's a pet project, you don't care what version of what package it's using, right? What you want is something rendered on the screen. This is how I start projects that are completely sort of greenfield, even personal projects as well, which is here's a clean repo. I don't care what you do. I don't care what libraries you import, as long as I'm not going to get sued for them because you pulled in proprietary code. Go forth and develop, and then I will go and figure it out later. I don't think we have that luxury when you still want to maintain control over your overall code base and the health of the monorepo.
Makes tons of sense. And I love that we naturally kind of arrived at background agents as well. And you've talked about one of the downsides of them, right? Is the problem with people not being at keyboards and like longer trajectory tasks is they also can go off piste and spend a lot of money and not actually achieve the outcome. And you're not necessarily watching it until it comes back. In the sort of our pre-discussion, you mentioned that you'd kind of taken a lot of inspiration from some of the stuff Uber, Ramp, and the teams publishing the open about their journey on background agents have done. So I'd love to kind of hear a little bit more about like what resonated for you about their journey and kind of what you're thinking of applying over at Monzo.
Yeah, that right now this is like we're as of right now, as of when we're recording this in sort of early May, this is still something that we've not fully cracked yet. So we've done the natural thing that I think most organizations have done, which is effectively have remote execution of models, and we've interfaced it with Slack, which is what we use as an organization on a day-to-day basis. But I think the real unlock is to open this organizationally wide, is to effectively have like a centralized interface, some form of UI, some web tooling or what have you, which brings in that organizational context alongside the agent. And you can see that this is what most model providers are trying to build. Notion has built it with Notion AI, where you can connect your whole organizational context and do that for documentation. Google have done that with Gemini, and what I take strong inspiration is that you look at Ramp and Uber, they have built that for their organizational context. This is one of the reasons why we take strong inspiration from off-the-shelf products, Notion AI and Gemini and things like that. But effectively, they are built for a general purpose market. Whereas, we have significant investment in the way that we do things organizationally. And, Uber and Ramp and a bunch of other companies, Stripe, they have spent significant amounts of time building the Chrome and building the interface so that it serves their organizational needs. And it's been a real unlock for these organizations where I speak to people on the ground. If they want to go and build prototypes, they've been able to integrate the way that they develop these systems and abstract these things away so that effectively you have a lovable style interface, which will go and generate code and package it up and go and deploy it onto their infrastructure seamlessly, and bringing in all of that organizational context rather than plugging in a pure third-party platform and calling that your interface. So I think this is what we are working towards and what we will be working towards, is sort of owning that interface space. Now, of course, we will be relying on third parties for like model serving and actually running some of these capabilities. But ultimately, that is infrastructure detail, right? It's very important infrastructure detail, but that is infrastructure detail. For what the user sees, the user effectively gets a feel of a very holistic view of how we do AI and LLMs with all the organizational context built in. I look to sort of think of it akin to how our consumer product, like our Monzo app, when you're sort of working with payments and you have a debit card and a credit card and a bunch of other stuff, right? A bunch of stuff goes in behind the scenes, but the consumer doesn't need to think about, the complexities of MasterCard SFTPs and reconciliation and maintaining a ledger and stuff. All this stuff is super critical, right? It's absolutely foundational. And that's what we need to build, is that foundational capability, build and buy. There's a mixture of both for those capabilities. And then provide our opinionated interface on top that ties all of these tools together, rather than just adopt tools from third parties and just plug them in and say that we're one and done.
That all makes tons of sense. One thing I've always admired about Stripe, Ramp, and also Monzo is, you're heavily regulated, but still always at the forefront of tech. And one thing I guess I'd love for you to maybe give a bit of a flavor for is, for a lot of companies, adopting background agents is probably going to be quite easy. Maybe they're a small company, they don't have a whole bunch of regulation. It might just be adding a couple of things in Slack, and a very simple open source or off-the-shelf solution might work for them. Can you give a little bit of a flavor of why that's not the case for you and some of the challenges that you have to deal with in your space that people may not be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing in regulation that stops you from adopting AI. And I think that is a statement that I say, for all things. There's nothing in regulation that stops you from adopting cloud, tech, an open source framework, a third party framework, or AI, anything, right? Regulation doesn't stop you from doing anything specific. Regulation isn't there to stop you. It provides guidance and guardrails, right? Like it provides controls of what you should be mindful of, and with penalties if you're not mindful about these things. So a really good example is what you do with data, right? If you're, for example, adopting an AI model, it's very easy to then transcend that so that you connect maybe your data warehouse using MCP, and now your data is being processed by the AI model, right? Now, if that AI model is then using that data for training, right? Effectively, you have now had data exfiltration that is being used as part of a training set, right? And that is where penalties will apply, right? And that is where most organizations have become scared and then just blanket said, no, we will do no MCP and no none of this stuff. Our philosophy and approach is very, very different. Instead, we want to enable these tools, but have very strict controls about where these tools are, hoovering up data. What are you able to ingest? What are you able to put into these models on a day-to-day basis? For example, we will say, okay, right, these tools should be used for these things, and we will add controls and monitoring and stuff for these tools, at the sort of access layer. And we will restrict away things like direct BigQuery access, or access to a particular a random third party or what have you. We'll say you're not allowed to call out to web search for this particular term that you might have found in a data set. There are controls that you can add that will stop the harmful stuff from happening. I sort of like to think of the flip side, which is, if you don't enable these tools for the organization, people will find a way, right? People will find a way to side skirt, getting access to these tools, even to the point where they will pay for it out of their own wallet, right? And by that fact, there's a losing battle, because then you have completely lost control. If someone is randomly signed up to a third-party LLM provider, which one crops up literally every week, they proxies access to Claude or whatever, because that is the way that they have side-skirted. Effectively, you've now got shadow IT. So this stance that we can't adopt background agents, AI, LLMs, whatever the stance is. You've got to meet the people where they are. They want to be able to go and use these tools. They might use these tools in their spare time or free time, or they might have used it for a side quest, or maybe in a prior organization. And by restricting these tools, people will side skirt and find a way, which I think is the worst of all outcomes. Instead, if we're able to give access to these tools in a controlled manner, be permissive where we can be restrictive where we really want to be, to make sure that we maintain control, security and reliability control, and have really good guidance on where how data should flow. All the same principles apply for just standard day-to-day. If you get access to a Google Sheet, you should not be exporting that Google Sheet and sharing it with your personal machine or your personal iPhone, right? It's a standard best practice that you should not be doing. And we have controls around this, to make sure that this doesn't happen, and we restrict capabilities. Same principle applies here. Make sure you have those restrictive capabilities where people might be doing something wrong, and then you can enable these tools and allow people to go and experiment.
The thing I love about your answer and kind of everything you're saying here is I think people think of AI as this brand new thing that we need to apply all these really special thinking towards, but actually it's not, especially in platform groups, platform teams like you. We've seen this story before, right? There's a new technology that people want to adopt. Maybe it's an editor, maybe it's a productivity tool, maybe it's a terminal, whatever it might be. And great tools always have a way of kind of bubbling up. People are going to find a way to use them, and actually much better to meet people where they are, to support them rather than trying to block everything and either causing them to go around it, or in an even worse scenario, the great people leave. They go and work somewhere that will support them with that productivity workflow. So although there is new capabilities that come with AI, like the actual story of how you adopt these things isn't too different from things we've seen before, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the same is applied for adopting anything. Technology, like a third-party supplier, what have you. The same principle applies here.
Yeah. So keeping that thread running, one thing you talked about a little bit was you're going to start looking around for whether you'll build or buy sort of a background agent platform. You've done this tons of times. I know we've spoken a few times about things you're exploring, building, buying, and Monzo does tend to be a company of builders. Like, how will you approach that conversation of building versus buying, and how will you ultimately decide what the right thing to do is here for you, and how can other people learn from your approach effectively?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think the key thing is that when we are building or buying, it's not a Boolean option, right? There will be a bunch of stuff that we will definitely buy, right? Like, we're not going to be training our own frontier models, or like, taking an open source model, and like, building our intelligence on top of it. The space is moving extremely quickly. And, to be frankly honest, like, I don't think most organizations can afford to, like, just with, all the capacity constraints, and the amount of stuff we want to build. I don't think it would be a fantastic use of our time, or our capacity or resources, both from an engineering and from a financial point of view. I don't think that would be a great use of time. So like, those things naturally, like, we will be buying in, and we take strong inspiration from the industry as well, like, the models that we adopt, and like, the tools that we onboard onto our systems. Where I think the build equation really comes into the foray is what you surface to users in your interface contract. So for example, like, if we said, okay, right, the thing what we're going to do is we're going to give Claude Code access to everyone, right? Claude Code is a very opinionated sort of batteries included product, right? That is constantly changing, right? Like, it's built by Anthropic. They release new features and stuff on a day-to-day basis. If that is your model of interface, you effectively become tied to Claude Code, right? And what we want to do is we want to try and own that interface as much as possible, and like, sort of have optionality. So for example, like, I've heard that Codex is really, really good nowadays for writing code. Codex doesn't fit into Claude Code, as far as I'm aware. Like, might be ways to work around that. So like, what does that shell look like? And I know there's open shells out there with open code and Pi and a bunch of really, really cool pieces of technology. I think that's like one really good example of what does the Chrome look like? What does the integration look like, right? I think for us, the thing that we will be building is that integration layer that we then surface to, Monzo engineers and non-engineers alike, right? Which I think is the thing that we are uniquely qualified to build. If you want to really reduce it, effectively, it is a UI, right? It is a UI with the background of it, the like infrastructure of it, is stuff that we have, like, in combination built and bought, from third parties and internally. But we want to make sure that we own the interface. We want to make sure that we own, for example, having all of the telemetry and evaluation, and like, where data goes in, and like, that sort of Chrome in the middle, so that we can make globally optimized decisions rather than teams making their own localized optimized decisions. For example, let's say that you're building like, an app, like, an AI powered app, right? You might say, okay, right, well, I really like OpenAI nowadays. I'm going to go build it in ChatGPT and, surface it as a ChatGPT app, right? Now, if OpenAI ceases to be a good model, right? Like, that doesn't like stop the existing thing from working, like, because it is working with the existing models. But if it stops being like, a good model or what have you, but now we've got this app that has accidentally become load bearing in the organization, because someone randomly built it, I don't think that is a good outcome. Like, it means that, like, we could have had something better. The new legion of frontier models, like, might have made this app really, really better, but we are tied down by having this app deeply integrated into the Chrome of ChatGPT and its web interface, which I don't think is a good way of doing it. So a lot of work that we're doing behind the scenes is like sort of, getting that LLM gateway in, and like, just having access to all these models. LLM evaluation is a really hot topic right now as well. Like, you're just having all of these things, all of these tools, so that, for example, you can say, okay, right, this thing works, right now today with Claude, but I'm able to take the data, with Opus 4.6. I'm able to take the data, and works equally as well with ChatGPT Codex 5.4, and you're able to switch over transparently. This also helps with some of the reliability story as well, like, which is also equally as important. If these tools are become load bearing in your organization, when the daily like downtime of any sort of third-party supplier happens, especially AI and LLM providers, you want to be able to fall back, and want to make sure that we have a really, really good story for that, and do that graceful degradation transparently, because people are going to be relying on these tools day in and day out.
Yeah, I love this. We've spent a lot of time on this. I think initially there was lots of products that kind of just let you plug in, like bring your own key, which makes tons of sense too. But I think when something does become load bearing and it's critical to your organization, like I've started to think of an LLM provider more like a database than an API. It's like it's really important that uptime is closer to like 4, 5, 6 nines than it is to have a cheap fast stream. Like the reliability is actually becoming core and central, and I don't feel like the industry's acknowledged that strongly enough yet. I think having every team manage their own like API keys, tokens is a failure mode, and I think we'll see a shift from that personally.
Yeah, actually, I really like that analogy. Seeing these tools as like database providers, infrastructure providers. And I might steal that as an analogy when I describe these things internally. But you're absolutely right. Obviously, like a lot of these tools are really good at providing really great interfaces. Like your LLM provider desktop, Claude desktop, OpenAI desktop, and their web counterparts as well, and integrations with all of these tools, front and center. But fundamentally, we want to be buying in the technology, which is the infrastructure behind the scenes, and effectively have our own opinionated stack about what is in front, the Chrome that is in front, the product that is in front, which is integrating our best practices and what we want to be able to achieve.
Yeah. There's one last thing you touched on a little bit that I would love to finish off on is you mentioned a little bit around like return on investment, effectively productivity, insights on how it's going. This has been the conversation for us this year. Last year was I want AI tools. This year is okay, prove they're worth the money, right? What am I getting from this? These, for a lot of people or a lot of companies, this is going to be their biggest line item on their infrastructure expense this year and next year and every year going forward. And so it's getting more important than ever to be able to say, okay, well, for this dollar you gave in, you got $2, $5, $10 out. How are you thinking about this internally, and what's your kind of plans for kind of deciding whether a tool is worth the value effectively?
Yeah, that is a conversation that we're having internally as well. I don't think we have a perfect answer. And to be honest, I would be skeptical of any organization right now who claims that they have a perfect answer to this, especially to have a mathematical equation, say I have put $1 in and I have gotten N amount of dollars out. Yes, okay, if you abstract it away, then maybe that is the case. But a significant amount of the dollars that we are spending is experimentation, right? I will put some amount of dollars in and hope, pray. Hope is the strategy. Hope is the strategy here. Hope that something useful comes out of it. Of course, there are a bunch of areas where we are adopting LLM technology, where there is a very clear net benefit. Helping with customers and detection and and stuff like that. I think for us, the key metric that we are looking at is the velocity increasing, the rate of pull requests, the rate of code change. I'm just talking about engineering metrics here. Yeah. The rate of code change, the rate of being able to ship and deliver products. I think what is interesting is that like most organization, we tracked all the DORA metrics and track DORA metrics per engineer and stuff like that. On top of platforms like DX and things like that. But effectively, all that becomes meaningless, right? The cost of raising a PR is basically zero, right? The tool can go and do it for you. The cost of writing the code is zero. So fundamentally, the thing that we are measuring is the impact you're able to have, right? Are you able to unblock yourself? Are you able to deliver that impact within a faster time frame? Is fundamentally the exam question that most organizations are asking. And I think that is a good way to frame it. A Monzo customer doesn't care how many PRs we have shipped, right? What they care about is that have you been able to ship the PR so that you can get new customer features or fix a bug or correct something that has been annoying you, or unlocked a new product feature that you've been really, really excited about, right? That is what you care about as a Monzo customer, and that is the thing that we want to accelerate as quickly as possible.
That makes tons of sense to me. Do you think we'll ever get to a world with AI models where we can get to like outcome-based pricing for engineering? Is that something you see ever being possible, or do you just think it's way too hard?
I'll be honest with you, I don't know the answer. Like, having with a model, having some form of predictability, right? And to know that, okay, like, with these classes of tasks, right? Like, I'm able to say, okay, right, like, we have been able to measure that with these amount of dollars we put in, these are this is the outcome that we achieve. Like, with that, you can have some sort of form of like outcome-based pricing. I think the real interesting dilemma is that when a new model comes out, the amount of experimentation and training, effectively starts from not zero, but like, close to zero again, right? Like, something has fundamentally changed, something has fundamentally gotten better or worse, a particular area is now like, much faster or much quicker and things like that. And even between model releases, like, changes in system prompts, there's a lot of like changes happening behind the scenes. So effectively you are working on a foundation of non-determinism, right? Whereas if you, for example, control the full end-to-end stack, you're picking an open model and you're able to control releases and stuff like that, you can have some form of like outcome-based pricing, which is, I have got this model, like, I use it for these tasks, for these tasks I come in, for every dollar that I spend on GPU inference, I'm able to get this amount of dollar out, which is why I've been able to automate it away, right? For these things, I think you can get to some outcome level pricing, but when it comes to like the latest and greatest and the frontier models and stuff that you depend on from third parties, I think the jury's still out, just because there's so much experimentation happening. We're sort of at a really interesting point in technology, and quite a frustrating one as well. Like, if you ask some people, which is, by the time you finally think you've got to grips with something new is out there, right? Like, before you feel like you've figured it out, whether that is true or not, or whether when you get that feeling, okay, right, I've now mastered it, I've now gotten somewhere, something new is out there. Yeah, this is how I felt with like the releases between the Opus 4.5 to 4.6 to 4.7. And there's been a bunch of stuff out there like on like Opus 4.7's like capabilities, and like system prompts changing and like it's training and that stuff. A whole bunch of discourse out there. These are fundamentally really fantastic capabilities, but deterministic is not the word that I would use to describe them. And if you don't have something deterministic, I don't think you can have a good quantification for outcome-based for pricing or utilization or telemetry.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. It's why engineering has always been hard to measure, right? Is because, okay, Suhail did 10 Jira tickets this week, Matt did 5. Who's more productive? And the answer is, I don't really know. We'd have to like dig way into the details and figure out all sorts of things. And by the time you figured it out, like it doesn't matter anymore. Move on. And so I think it's a really challenging space. And I think people have this strong desire to get us towards outcome-based pricing, but I'm the same as you. I don't see a path there, but I'm very curious to see how this plays out. I saw Stripe publish something this week where they were charging like $2 to rate your API using LLMs. And then I saw Intercom do outcome-based pricing for the AI-assisted chatbot. And I see that Claude, I think we're charging like $5 or something to do like a deep PR review as well. So you can see the experimentation happening in the space, and they're trying to find the line where people are happy to pay for an outcome, even if it is non-deterministic. But I don't really see how we can generalize that. But I'm excited to see others try.
Yeah, I think what is really interesting is sort of that evaluation. Like, how do you determine what is a good outcome? Do you build outcome-based LLM tools that to test the LLM tools? How far down the stack do you go? If you've got something that is a binary answer, like this is good or this is bad, and you're able to deterministically infer that, then yes, like you can have outcome-based pricing. I don't think we are quite there for a lot of the usages that LLM tools unlock. Is this a good answer? Is this a reliable answer? Is this a deterministic answer? Does it answer my question? I think all we have right now is proxy metrics across the industry.
Completely agree. Awesome. I just want to thank you so much for your time, Suhail. This was like super interesting. If people want to learn a little bit more about Monzo, more about you, where can they find you and what do you recommend they pick up on? I know you're a prolific speaker, so if there's any talks you want to point people at specifically as well, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Suhail Patel on all the things online. And if you want to get in touch, then I am at suhailpatel.com. So please do drop me a message. Suhail Patel on everything else on X, Blue Sky, all the social networks that you might want. And for Monzo, we are at monzo.com. We are hiring if you are based in Europe and the UK. So please do get in touch. And yeah, if you've got any sort of remarks on what we have talked about today or what is happening in the industry, I would love to hear it. You'll also find me at a bunch of conferences. We'll be at Lead Dev in London soon, and we'll be at QCon as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Suhail.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt, and thank you for having me.